All right. We're being recorded.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Noble webinar series. This is the last of the year. My name is Mary Reisner. I'm Associate Director at the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida, and I'm founder of Noble. And our guest today is Sheri Spaine Long, Spanish professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And before I pass the mic over to talk about this very interesting topic of leadership in the language. I'm just going to go through a couple slides to see you all are joining us from. So can everyone type in the chat box where they're joining from? Chicago, California. Oh, we got some
Good spread.
Is this David Janer in Georgia? Oh, okay, good. I was wondering if that was you.
Good, good. Hey, David.
And the other people hear us? Because a few people didn't respond. Oh, Margaret's here. Margaret, we got someone from DC. Maybe that was everyone. Did Carmen say where she was from? Did Carmen? And the Globe. Beatriz, did she put in there that she's Madrid?
Yes.
Yeah, there she is. Okay, great. All right, so before we delay too much longer, I did want to mention we have a new handbook. It's mainly for K through 12 teachers, but I think the college faculty could probably pick up on some good ideas from it as well. So, go ahead and check it out. Which I did not put the link on this slide, but if you go to Noble, it's on the front page. And there's some good resources. Quite a few of them are on leadership. They are with Spanish examples, but they can definitely be adapted to any language. And I'm actually looking for volunteers and collaborators that want to convert and do some of these materials into other languages. Feel free to contact me. Other Noble resources, to go to the web. For K through 12 programs and secondary for medical, legal, business, leadership, etc. And we're always looking for collaborators to work on. Finally, the webinar proposals for next year. The call will be coming out end of this month, June, and throughout the summer. So I'm looking forward to what people submit. So I am going to, that was my spiel, and I am gonna let Sheri put her PowerPoint up. As she is presenting, feel free to type in the chat, and I'll manage the chat a little, she'll look at it, and we'll also.
Great, thank you. I've got to go back to the initial screen. Right. I want to thank Mary for the opportunity to do this. We've talked about it for months on end, and what was I thinking? I picked what is the last week of class for a lot of the people in higher ed, or finals week. So what I want to try and do is energize you at a very tiring point in the year. If you are in K through 12, you're also hitting exhaustion, and tell you about the language classroom and leadership development, and hopefully we'll have as well. So what I'd like to do to start is actually talk very briefly about a tool that is out, and it's Lead with Languages. A lot of you have seen this, but I'll bet everybody has not seen it, and it's so good it's worth seeing multiple times. It is essentially a campaign that ACTFL is rolling out, and I want to give a nod to Paul Sandrock, who's listening, who is the education director, and Marty Abbott, of course, who's the executive director of ACTFL. And what I want to do is actually just play this for you. It's less than a minute and a half, and that way you'll get a sense of the tone setting that I want to do here. We are going to be talking perhaps more about leadership inside the classroom. But what's really fun about this video is it really sets the tone for associating languages and language education with leadership in general. And the audience isn't just us, but it's the audience beyond educators and out to the general public. So with that said, I am going to tell you that I am not alone this afternoon. I am sitting by a wonderful colleague, Dr. Bobby Hobgood, who is the director of our Language Resource Center. And we're going to do a quick shuffling, and he's going to help me show this. So with no further ado, change places if it's easier.
Okay.
Great.
Okay.
One day to a new reality. A world where English is only one of thousands of languages, and 90% of Americans are left out of the conversation. Realize that that day today, in the world we share with 7 billion people, 75% understand any English, and the fastest growing economies across the globe are English speaking. How can we succeed in commerce, in diplomacy, and in our careers in today's multilingual and multicultural world? With languages. Learning other languages is essential for America. Language competency equips our workforce for a competitive job market. It opens the doors for businesses of every size to connect with the 95% of the world's customers who live outside our borders. And in an era of increased global challenges and conflicts, it empowers our diplomatic, military, and intelligence communities to be effective in their missions. Outside the US, knowing multiple languages is the standard, not the exception. Time to wake up and lead ourselves from today to tomorrow with languages. Let's make languages a national priority to prepare Americans for a brighter future in a more connected world.
All right, exit full screen. All right, give me a minute just to get back into the PowerPoint. All right. I hope you enjoyed that. It's a really nice piece, and it's something that obviously is really targeting an external audience, but I think when we're working with our students and we're talking about leadership development being related to languages, they are also our target audience because they don't automatically think about the language classroom as being a place that they're going to be learning about leadership. So with that said, it's a great resource. It's available at the ACTFL website, or you can jump on the Google and just put Lead with Languages, and there it is. You can listen to it over and over again and use it with whomever you choose to. Another resource that is more inward looking that is out there for you on the ACTFL website that inspired my journey through this language and leadership branch that I'm standing on today is essentially another great resource, which is the ACTFL 21st Century Skills Map. And the Skills Map was rolled out in 2011. And on the ACTFL 21st Century Skills Map, what you're going to find are essentially 12 different skills that are essential for success in the 21st century. And the last one, the 12th one, is leadership and responsibility. And so if you go to that place on the ACTFL site, you're going to find that laid out in name, and there are examples. There are also, there's a place where you can upload things that you do with your students that have to do with teaching leadership and leadership development in the language classroom. So there are some materials there as well, and resources that I wanted to obviously call out very early in the presentation. Okay, so what are we going to do this afternoon? What I'd like to do is essentially this. These are our goals. I want to give you some down and dirty background on why leadership and language teaching. We know that ACTFL is very invested in this, but there are some other constituencies and other places where this leadership dialogue with language teaching is also bubbling up. We also want to look at what we know now. What do we know about leadership development, and what does it look like in the language classroom? And so we're going to talk about that briefly. There's been a couple of research projects that I've been involved in, both of them at the U.S. Air Force Academy, but also I've replicated some of the research here at UNC Charlotte. So this isn't military specific in any form or fashion. And then from there, I want to share with you some examples, some materials, some tools, and then hopefully we can also discuss future directions for languages and leadership. Because if you look at this as a pedagogical field, it's kind of in diapers. We have a lot of experimentation going on now and a lot of energy moving in this direction, but there hasn't been a lot of research. And there are limited materials out there that I want to point out to you. And so we're at a very good place to kind of think about what is it that we should be doing next to be taking this charge very seriously. So what I would like to do at this point is just do a really quick down and dirty poll. Since we have this great chat room, I'd love to know if you are currently including leadership in your classroom and in your curriculum. And if so, you can wildly start typing. I know that a lot of you are. I know the work of some of you, and then I know that some of you, it may be a fairly new concept. And hopefully, as I see things coming in, we can look at and take some of your examples more toward the end of the presentation, so that we can get a sense of what you might be doing already that dovetails with things that I'm doing. Oh, great! I can see that we've got some things going on in high school. Yes. I also see some other things going on with community-based partnerships, team projects, etc. Great. So these are ways that it sounds like some of you are exploring leadership in the language classroom. And so we'll be talking about, why to do this and how to maybe beef it up. It is something that I'm advocating, and I think that you need to think about why you're advocating something. I mean, I went to the wonderful webinar that Annie Abbott did in the series, and if it was not this one, it was the second to the last webinar that was done, and she talked a lot about our students that have been through the recession, and they've been scared in terms of the job market. They take it very seriously, and so you can roll out leadership in the language classroom as a value added. It's not something that they necessarily thought they were going to get when they signed up for your Spanish or your Japanese or your German class. And we can weave this into what we're currently doing. And essentially, under this very broad umbrella of leadership, you can think of it as sort of pre-professional training that can fit inside of just about any course, a lit course, a language course. Of course, there are language for specific purposes courses that we frequently think about being very focused on a particular curriculum like business or Spanish for the health professionals, or French for business. And a lot of times that leadership training has been put in those courses, but not extended more broadly across the curriculum. So I'm seeing great things in the chat box that are really inspiring, talking about entrepreneurship. That's a great place for leadership training to occur as well. So I think this kind of thing, leadership development, really can happen at any level, elementary through higher ed. It's also very useful beyond the workplace. You use leadership skills when you're dealing with your family, when you're dealing with community groups. And so it's something that's very transferable and general and useful for people to be able to use the suite of skills that you possess when you think about developing leadership skills in tandem with languages. So let's talk about what those might be. But before we do that, let me point this out. I am going to be referencing a number of materials during the presentation, and my colleague Bobby Hobgood helped me set up my very first Google Drive. I'm very proud of myself to now have a Google Drive. And so you will see there the bit.ly URL that you can go to, and you can take a look at the materials. I will reference them quickly because we have limited time today, and so you can go in there, you can take a look, and if you want to drill down on some of the examples or drill down on an actual source for one of my claims with respect to the research, please, I invite you to go in. Some of them are materials that they're more scholarly and they have to do with publication, and other materials there's an example of one of my syllabi and how I weave leadership into it. There are some student examples and so forth. So there's a variety of things going on there. All right. So what I'd like to do is have us think about these two statements as a starting point, and going back to the ACTFL skills map. And beyond ACTFL, others have surely pointed out to us in the business community, in the private sector, in government and nonprofits, all over the place, that leadership and responsibility is a critical skill for the future. And it seems to be in the air. You can't walk through an airport without seeing a slew of leadership manuals and books. It's almost become cliche. And so that is one of the assumptions, that this is statement that was the summary statement or the punchline of a research project that was done out at the Air Force Academy, where we actually formed a faculty learning community and explored how leadership was being taught in a language environment, in a rather large department, across levels, across different languages, in an environment where leadership, because it was a military environment, but an undergraduate educational enterprise that would be the U.S. Air Force Academy, how it was being woven into the curriculum. And what was interesting is we did a lot of focus groups, we did a lot of feedback forms, we collected data in a number of ways. And what we learned was that the punchline, knowing multiple languages and cultures helps produce good leaders, that language educators kind of already know this, but that it was almost like we were keeping this statement a secret from our students, which makes absolutely no sense. And so now what we decided to do is I roll this statement out and I put it on my syllabi, usually on the first page. It's an introductory course or a lit course. I put knowing multiple languages and cultures helps produce good leaders, because our students are not fully aware of how knowing languages and cultures relates to leadership. We're pretty clear on that because we understand the communication piece, and that you have to be a good communicator across languages, and you have to be able to interpret people, and so on and so forth. But our students often are just sort of, understanding and coming to this understanding. So I would encourage you to do the same. There is a summary of this research on a poster, one pager. And the great thing about doing webinars is you can wave things around in the air. The poster looks like this. And it's a one pager that summarizes the research that I did with a team of terrific colleagues out there. And then also there's an article that was published in Dimension that also addresses that in detail if you're interested in it. Okay, so what I want to do is get going on some really basic things. And one basic thing is that you need to know, and it's not lost on you if you're out there, that there are many, many, many definitions of leadership. And there are many detailed definitions of leadership. I tend to use a very simple one with students, and you can even boil it down more than just being able to engage others to accomplish a mutual goal. Sometimes I see it rendered graphically as leadership is equal to influence. But at its base, you're trying to get others to do something, and normally for the common good. And so it's an opportunity to talk with your students very briefly about leaders being good followers, and that good leaders are good followers as well. And this is a very useful concept for all citizens. I mean, I want to live in a civil society. I'm sure you do too. And we know that this kind of thought process of being able to work together to accomplish mutual goals helps us with mutual understanding. If you want to work toward world peace, a lofty goal, you've got to be able to establish this kind of communication and lead. If you want to just do a task in a Spanish class on a Friday afternoon and get through it so that you can go home and have a Coca-Cola, then great. It also helps if somebody is leading the group through an activity. So we're talking about communication and basic definitions there. So what I want to talk about at this point is just point out to a confluence of things that I believe have been going on for the last 20, 25, 30 years in our field and beyond our field, and that would be the case for why adding leadership now to your curriculum. And before I kind of run through the list with you and point these things out that will look, I think, familiar to a lot of you as language educators, I want to point out something to you that will date me, but hopefully be useful information. And it goes like this. Some of you may remember when we as language educators were being asked to add culture to our curriculum. And people reacted like, wow, how are we going to do that? That's going to be so much more work. And it sounds laughable right now I'm sure if you're a younger language educator, you think, well, that's ridiculous. We think of them as being the same thing. When we teach language, we're teaching culture, and we think of them as being completely fused in one entity, if you will. And so I'm sort of putting that out there as a historical reference, simply to get you to thinking about the fact that as we're talking about adding leadership to the language classroom, I don't want you to think of it as a big add-on. What we found when we added culture to the language classroom is that we were doing it anyway. We just started doing more of it, and the way we did it became more nuanced, and we learned about, big C and little c and all kinds of special types of culture that we have been infusing into our repertoire, including pragmatics and things like that. But this all happened incrementally, and I believe that this adding leadership on, if you will see today that you're already doing a lot of these things. And we're really just talking about notching up your game with respect to leadership, and then moving incrementally toward having it be a value added to be able to offer that to your students and get in sync with what's a movement that's happening in the rest of the curriculum as well. And so if you look at the bullets with me briefly, what you're going to see, and I'm going to try and use the arrow. Oh, I don't think I'm able. So I will be up there it is. The professional and societal priority. I think we've talked about ACTFL's claim that we are actually already doing leadership in the language classroom, and that in everywhere we go. And so there's societal pressure to add leadership and to consider this in future directions. There's professional pressure, if you will. A lot of us are also teaching in schools that have mission statements that talk about producing leaders, future leaders, and good global citizens. And so there's a lot of lip service that talks about this kind of thing, and sometimes there's not that much evidence or that much guidance as to how to go about it. So we've talked about ACTFL, talking about leadership being a critical skill for the future, the Languages for Careers movement, and that makes you think immediately of Mary Reisner and Darcy Lear and Annie Abbott and so forth, that we know the Languages for Specific Purposes movement has been percolating for the last 20 to 30 years, and now really has more traction than ever because our students are coming into our classrooms with a very fixed idea that they have to have a career plan. So they tend to be more interested in these add-ons like leadership more than ever when they understand where it might take them. So you have to make that clear to them, because a lot of working with leadership in the classroom will have to do with intentionality and making things explicit. I also want to point out that we have the content-based movement in language learning that's been going on for 30 to 40 years, if I'm not mistaken, with Stryker and Lever and others. And we know that we have, and we're very lucky to have this sense of a very fluid content. We can move different kinds of content in and out of our courses with ease. And so leadership and leadership studies is a great way to be able to do this. That certainly lines up with what the MLA has been telling us. They came out with a report in 2007 that talked about interdisciplinarity and becoming more interdisciplinary with respect to language and culture programming and the changes in the curriculum. And then lastly, we mentioned the teaching of culture. And when you look at the teaching of culture, when you look at what teaching leadership can point out to students, they're going to figure out that leaders look different across cultures. They're going to figure out that leaders have different behaviors when you start crossing cultures. And sometimes, and I'll just throw out a very obvious example, sometimes you will notice things with respect to gender that is different across cultures. So this is a great moment where you can be teaching something about leadership, but you're teaching culture as well. So the teaching of culture supports this leadership movement as well. All right, so what I want to do is give you some brief background about what went on at the U.S. Air Force Academy, ways that we found to talk about approaches to leadership development in the classroom. We started out with a couple of assumptions, and these assumptions essentially have to do with the fact that sometimes when you hear the dogma of leadership coming at the language classroom, you're thinking, uh-oh, big problem, because you may be advocating adding a lot of English to my classroom. So I'm going to take the second one first. And no, that is not what this is about. What we're trying to do, and what we've been trying to do in a seamless fashion, is look at ways that we can keep the discourse, as ACTFL points out in their policy statement, keep the discourse of the language classroom in the target language primarily, but be able to infuse leadership development into the classroom without taking things into English, if you will. And so there are some moments that I use English. I'll give you some examples. Sometimes I have students do reflective journals in English outside of class, but I try to keep the action in the classroom in Spanish because that's the language that I teach. And so this is not an agenda to undermine target language teaching. And then the first one that I alluded to earlier, that this idea that languages and cultures are inseparable, that's another baseline assumption behind this talk today and the research that's been done, that these two entities are inseparable. And so that's important to keep in mind as well, because you will have people argue with you and say, well, this language or this leadership and culture stuff, why don't we just teach it in English in an English-speaking class and, you know, cloister the language piece? And of course, we know as language educators that just doesn't work. And so it's good to keep those things in mind. So after we did a piece of research out at the U.S. Air Force Academy, we found ways to categorize leadership development that we found were useful to be able to talk about them and talk about the kinds of activities that we want to develop and use with our students. And so essentially what you're going to see is that there are two categories or two types of leadership development that occur in the language classroom. And what you will see there are some are generic approaches to teaching leadership. And I'm going to break them down for you in a minute, but to give you a quick example, a generic approach to teaching leadership development might happen in your class, which might be a French class or a German class, but they might be similar approaches to what is going down the hallway with the math instructor or the math teacher or the math professor, who might also be thinking of infusing leadership into his classroom or her classroom. So when you look at generic approaches, and I'll give you a definition of them in just a minute, those are perfectly legitimate ways to be working on leadership in the language classroom, but they can also be seen in other educational arenas. The one that I find particularly interesting and I think important for us to think about is that the discipline-specific approaches to teaching leadership development are something that we own. You're not going to find them in any other classroom. And why would that be? That would essentially be because we have that unique insider perspective into language and culture that other instructors simply do not have because of our delivery method and our insider perspective into the culture. And so we want to pay special attention to these, because if our students don't get these disciplines specific, and then I also want to give a nod to these two other last bullets on the slide, and that would be that there are two other approaches to teaching leadership development, or modalities, if you will, and one of them is when you teach about leadership explicitly. So when you are doing so, if you are making a big deal about leadership and calling out something while you're teaching as being, we are paying attention to the leadership in this text, or this particular leader and her approach to something, or his approach to something, that would be an explicit approach where it's very key and very clear and very salient that we're calling out leadership studies and thinking about leadership development directly with our students. But you also are doing implicit leadership development all the time. I mean, I think the best example is that you are a role model and a leader to your students, and you are probably not you're not going, hey, I'm a leader. You're just doing it, and your students are learning from it. And so these two kinds of leadership development are ongoing all the time in the classroom. So let's take a quick look at integrating leadership and thinking about things that you do with your students. A lot of these things you already are doing with your students, and you may have been teaching leadership and you didn't even know it. And the great thing is, a lot of these things really came into the fore with the standards, and then later when we started breaking out, what do the standards really mean? Well, it means, we're going to get a presentational skill, and so look at these things with me on the PowerPoint briefly, and you'll see that these generic approaches to teaching leadership, like assigning oral presentations and reports, that builds leadership development. If a student has to get up in front of the classroom, that's clearly something that's going to help them be able to lead others. Now, we'll get into how to emphasize that with students. Something that you tend to need to be able to do is design some sort of a rubric that includes the fact that if students are giving oral presentations and reports, that they're actually going to be assigned points or get some sort of credit for considering the audience, because leaders consider the audience because they're trying to influence an audience. They're trying to communicate directly with an audience, and that would be the classroom sometimes and sometimes not. It depends on the oral presentation. And so that's something that you probably already do, and you can put more of an emphasis on it being a leadership activity, and it would be very easy to up your game there with very little effort. And so what I'm after with some of these things, the generic leadership development approaches, there tends to be a lot of low-hanging fruit here that you can utilize. I know most of you are designing group and team activities, but you may or may not be calling out a leader each time you do it, or a leader and then another person in the group who has a support job, and then you giving the leader a particular task at the end of the the activity. So if you up your game in those categories, that helps develop leadership development as well. Praising student leadership is something that some of us are more comfortable with than others. People of a certain generation got into a rut, and that would be me, of we're sort of the generation of like everybody's the same and we don't want to call anybody out for anything in our classroom. But in case in point, if we don't start calling out students that are showing leadership in our classroom, and that might be the student who's helping another student that needs help, getting through an activity or something like that, that's showing leadership, that's part and parcel, because when you are integrating leadership, we are calling out behaviors. And I think we're very comfortable as language educators talking about what knowledge we want our students to possess, and we like to think about the process of learning a language a lot. But we don't always think about the behavioral change piece that can happen in the classroom, and that's really teaching to the whole student. Another one that I think that we can think about, and that's very important, and what was kind of pleasing to me is this came out of the cadets or the students that languages and cultures is not just a bunch of fun and games, because we know the stereotypes that exist about our field. And the fact that a lot of people just think, oh, it's so much fun, they can't possibly be doing anything intellectual in that class, that Spanish class down the hallway, when in fact we really are. And so when you think about promoting critical thinking with your students, and thinking about a leadership development moment, maybe when you're looking at a leader in another culture, analyzing his or her behaviors, and then reflecting, you're doing some pretty sophisticated things there that have to belong to the critical thinking camp. You're analyzing, you're reflecting, and arriving at conclusions. And so it's important to keep that in the mix as well, and not just think of this as a bunch of physical activities, if you will. And then lastly, the last generic leadership development approach that we categorized was providing role modeling that we mentioned earlier. But I wanted to say that, you can focus on leadership and mentorship. You can think about role modeling as occurring instructor to student, but you might consider adding student-to-student mentoring that might occur in or outside the classroom with upper-level students, lower-level students. If you're in a high school, there are sometimes ways you can do that. Sometimes you already have it built into your classroom because you're teaching two levels at the same time. There are a lot of possibilities there. So that's something that if you develop these things fully, you are helping leadership development come along, if you will. Okay, so let's look at discipline-specific leadership development approaches. These are the ones that I said that are very specific to us, that they're not necessarily going to get in anywhere else in the curriculum. And so the first grouping happens through experiential learning, and we'll be spending less time on those today. But I did think that I think it's very interesting. I read the ACTFL skills map site. If you go there and you look at what instructors and teachers have written about leadership development and responsibility, what you will find, or what I found when I went in and looked, was that there were some activities that took students outside the classroom to places like service learning venues, interacting with the community, because that builds leadership clearly, because they have to work on certain kinds of skills to roll them out in the community. Internships, that would fill the bill, and those sorts of examples were up on the ACTFL site, and those are great examples. Another thing that we can look at is study abroad, and I was lucky to be in this department here at UNC Charlotte during the summer when there weren't a lot of people around, and I found myself involved in a Japanese project. We were lucky to send a group of students to Japan for 10 days on a grant that kind of fell out of the sky, the Kakahachi Bridges project. It was a great experience for our Japanese students. And so they had to do a journal. And when they did this journal, what I asked them to do, and obviously they were not writing in Japanese because I don't read Japanese, nor do I speak it. But this reflective piece, they were functioning in Japanese when they were over there. But I gave them the prompt before they went abroad. And this is a short-term study abroad. So you have to think realistically, what are they going to get out of that? What can they pull out of it? And what can you ask them to look for that they can bring home and reflect on even further? And so what I did was I asked them to think about what leaders and leadership look like in Japan, and if they look the same or different than their experience in the U.S. And these are largely American students at UNC Charlotte that participated in this study abroad. And they came up with some really interesting observations when they got back. They journaled, and then they wrote an essay for me as a way of garnering credit that ran with this experience. And they talked about the age difference, the leadership piece, the respect for age, and they had all kinds of wonderful observations. So students, when they're asked to observe and reflect, that's a great way that they can use a short-term study abroad experience. I know that in a lot of high schools have these very short, down and dirty spring break, take your students and pray the teacher that's a chaperone survives. But this is a great way to get them focusing on cultural differences and leadership differences. That's a really great value added. And so what we did find when you look at this slide when we were out at the U.S. Air Force Academy is this list on this slide is what students said they wanted more of with respect to leadership development and leadership training. They especially wanted study abroad because, there's limited opportunities and there's limited money. But when we got down to what's the next best thing, is really what you can do in class with your students to sort of build this sort of cultural adeptness so that when they end up in culture and in language, they're appropriate. So a lot of what we're going to be doing, especially at the intro level and the intermediate level, is building this kind of filter for appropriateness. And that's not something that all of our students and certainly all of our sons and daughters come wired up with. And so some of it seems kind of commonsensical, especially if you've been working in the field for years. But it really is something that is useful. And so what we're going to be looking at a little later in the presentation are some cultural scenarios that we developed at the Air Force Academy. We also would encourage very much this idea of doing simulations, doing role plays, doing capsules, doing mini dramas, but allowing yourself a space to think about teaching culture and leadership fused with language, and think about problem-solving opportunities and critical incidences in culture. A lot of your textbooks and teaching materials may have materials like this already, but they're largely labeled cultural scenarios. And so you might need to beef up the leadership piece to get them to think about not just reacting personally in culture, but reacting as a person who represents a culture, a company, a workplace, a university, a high school. And so those are things that these are ways that you can approach teaching leadership and developing, if you will, a repertoire of ways to put an emphasis on leadership development in your sort of daily classroom. And we will be looking at some examples. But I want to pop to this next slide and say what I would recommend you do first if you get involved in teaching languages and leadership is establishing some sort of baseline survey or feedback form. And it doesn't need to be a form. It can be a discussion with your students. It can be very, very simple. If you're teaching junior high, you wouldn't want to do something like this. But I was teaching a lit course. And so what I wanted to get at was what my students know coming into my classroom about leadership and followership already. What are they bringing in? And since this stuff tends to be in the air, what's really interesting is that students can down and dirty. This was a take it home. I didn't even do it in Spanish. It was at the beginning of the course. I just said take it home, read what we're going to do in the course, and then just down and dirty scribble out what you want to talk about with respect to leadership and fellowship. See if they can list some of the characteristics. So I have an example here for you that I have a screen grab of essentially a worksheet that I gave my students. I have this worksheet up on the Google site if you want to see a couple of student examples and what they came up with. But what's on the rest of the sheet essentially goes like this. I asked them to think about whether they would anticipate any significant differences between Spain, because this was a peninsular lit class, and the U.S. with respect to leadership roles, roles of leaders. Think about how they're viewed, how might they be different, how might they be similar. Their impressions came from. And what you're going to find now is that there are so many courses on your campuses, in your student clubs, in your student groups, in your church groups that have to do with leadership, that your students are coming into class at very different levels of leadership development. Some of them may actually be doing leadership studies as a major or a minor, and so they really speak this language, maybe even more than you do. I certainly had that experience when I was at the Air Force Academy. The cadets were much more sophisticated than I was, because I had to, bone up on this stuff. And so I think that's fine, and I think that it's something that's within the grasp of anybody to start reading about leadership development. But you want to find out who you're working with, and I think you'll find you have a real mixed bag. It's just like when you're doing language education, you have a real mixed bag walk in the door. But take a baseline is the point I'm trying to make there. And from there, I want to say, and I'm advocating that leadership development can be visible in the language curriculum and that it should be stated directly. So what I'm advocating today is that we get beyond experimentation and just say that we're doing languages and leadership a little bit, but let's think about it on a slightly different plane, and let's think about it as being something that might be measurable. I know people hate that word, and that it might be included in some of our goals and some of our outcomes. And so I want to give you a resource book that you might want to take a look at with respect to sort of getting the vocabulary and approaching writing cultural leadership goals, language goals that are all in one. So I'm not talking about adding on a lot of stuff to like your syllabus or your lesson planning, but how can we embed leadership? And so I found this particular book to be very useful, and in fact attended Corey C. Weiler's webinar. And it is a book that has 60 leadership competencies that are essential for careers across a broad spectrum. And so this book, the Student Leadership Competencies Guidebook, gives you the language. And also it's great for busy language educators. I'm going to start wildly waving it around because A, it's skinny, and B, there's lots of white space in it. And so if you're looking at it, you can do a lot of scanning and skimming, and you can get at what you're trying to get at with your students. It breaks things down. For example, it talks about self-awareness in leadership development. It talks about the values and competencies like helping others, like empathy, like ethics, and really breaks these things out, so it gives you a vocabulary to be able to think about. Let's get beyond experimentation with leadership, which is a good place to start, and then let's think about getting some evidence behind our claims. Are we really teaching leadership? If we are, let's get it in our goals and outcomes. So to do that, I just want to give you two really basic examples. The first one is what I would call a starter goal. It's a basic goal. It could be used in almost any level of classroom or language or lit class or a culture class, and it just goes like this: that the student displays class leadership through behavior that's appropriate to future professionals or good global citizens, depending upon your student group. And so that's something that I just I put it on every syllabus now, and that I have this expectation of students behaving in a particular way in my classroom. And so that's a very basic one, and it's a good place to start. There are more complicated and complex goals, the second one being an example, and that would be that the student analyzes a variety of leaders from the target culture and considers the role of personal assumptions and cultural beliefs in Spanish language texts. And so if I were doing a whole course and I had a bunch of materials that were selected to showcase leaders from Spain and Mexico and so forth, that the students would be able to really do something sophisticated and analyze differences between these leaders, and then think about the personal assumptions and cultural beliefs that go behind the behaviors they're seeing. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done with respect to looking at the different kinds of goals and outcomes that we might want to be authoring and including in our course. That you are going to need to teach the basic vocabulary of leadership in the target language. I have a screen grab here of a syllabus. It was from a lit class, and a lot of you, I realize, don't even use syllabi with your students, but you would just be doing this orally. You would be showing in your course, I used in this course the overarching theme of el liderazgo, which happens to be the term for leadership in Spanish, and then actually grabbed the definition from the Spanish Royal Academy of the words, so they start getting used to words that are associated with leadership. And this and it's very easy to do in Spanish, but I also had colleagues doing it in Chinese, in Arabic, and so forth at the Air Force Academy, and it seemed doable across languages. So that's another way in to starting this. Another way, or another thing that I wanted to show you that is another way into teaching leadership is something that we're doing in one of my textbooks, which is it's an introductory Spanish textbook called Nexos, and with my co-authors we're working on the 4th edition right now. And so we have these things, these are statements woven into the text that talk about the 21st century skills. And sometimes we're talking directly to the student. They're essentially text annotations, but they're like little asides that we're talking and taking the student aside, and while they're getting all this content in language, there are these little reminders that occur in the text. So we have little reminders to the student about how we are pushing students out of their comfort zone, and how that's something that they will learn leadership from, because they're going to learn how to interact responsibly with those from other backgrounds. And so these are little reminders. There's been a lot of work on millennial students and how they learn better if they understand why they're doing something and they have an explanation behind it. And so when they have these moments that make them uncomfortable, and I think the obvious example would be the typical moment you have when you take that introductory group of students abroad and they have to eat something that they find repugnant, and you don't want them to be inappropriate in somebody's home or in a restaurant. And so if you do these kinds of activities where there are cultural scenarios, skill building. Another way to do this is that we call things out for the instructors, and we remind them as they're working their way through activities with students to be organizing students into groups. I think most of us are very used to just throwing students into groups and throw them into 3s or 4s, or form groups of 3s and 4s. You can ask them to designate a leader. Here we're explicitly asking the instructor to designate a leader, a follower. A lot of people rotate so that it doesn't become one of these things where the same person is always the leader, et cetera, et cetera. But that kind of activity that's intentional, this intentionality piece can't be stressed enough, because basically you're teaching behavior and you're pushing particular kinds of behaviors. Okay, so I want to give you a couple more quick examples here. And so another quick example is an example that I have from our textbook, and it's just a scenario that goes like this. This is in Spanish. I'll paraphrase it for you quickly, and it's a scenario that happens in a restaurant. And so there's a group of, we've got groups of 3 students. They've been asked to act out the following situation. So they're going to read the situation, and then they're going to prepare a script, and then they're going to put on a skit for their classmates. And so the situation here is pointed out. Tu jefe te invita a cenar. And so we have your boss or your supervisor has invited you out to dinner. You're a little bit nervous because you don't know what, no sabes de lo que quiere hablar. You don't know what he wants or she wants to talk about. And then lo and behold, the waiter is an old friend of yours, and so the waiter or waitress comes up and makes a lot of recommendations about what you should be having for dinner. And then you're not really hungry, and so at the end of this, it says, y no quieres lo que te sugiere, and you don't actually want to eat what this individual suggests to you. So this is a fairly complex situation. You've got your boss, you've got a friend, you've got different things going on. And so in the box below, we have a to the student. So before they just put on a funny skit, and they think of something funny or clever that they want to act out with their peers, you cue them into this being a leadership and responsibility activity. And so essentially, there's the cue, and it says, how do you show leadership in this situation? Do you order what you feel like, or do you modify your order? Do you consider the expectations of others? Will your behavior depend on the cultural expectations of your supervisor, etc.? And there's no correct answer, and it's very important to let students know that. But there is a hint, and it says, however, leadership includes being a good follower. So these are like really simple ways that you all, I assume, are probably doing activities like this with your students in your various languages, and you can tweak these things up to really focus on the leadership piece and make them dual purpose, triple purpose. You're going to be using the language, you're going to be learning about the culture, and you're going to be thinking about leadership development all at the same time. I know that time is flying, so I want to be able, and I can assure you I have very little left, but I want to just show you very briefly a couple more examples to get you thinking about the Lit course. If I have any people that are doing AP Lit or doing Lit courses in higher ed or doing culture courses. And so with languages and leadership, when you look at literature and culture, what you're going to be doing, there's a pedagogy where you've got this intentional presence of leadership flowing throughout the course. And one of the ways you do that is in the setup. You select text to highlight leadership. And so I'll have an example for you here with what I do in Spanish. You have to teach the basic vocabulary. I've mentioned that already. And you want to make leadership salient in the procedures and in the activities in those Lit and culture courses. So what might that look like? I have a Spanish example, but I want to say that I've seen this done in other languages as well. And so there's there's literature that I think teaches leadership very well, and one of the resources that Mary showed at the very beginning of the webinar, and that would be the terrific LSP handbook, K through 12. There's a great example that includes Don Quixote that I'm going to just emphasize in a moment. But what I will show you here with these 4 works, and I'm not going to have time to talk about them individually, but I want you to notice a couple of things. What you have in front of you are essentially 4 names of 4 different authors, some from Spain, there's one from Mexico, and notice they're from across the time continuum. So when you're talking about leadership behaviors and what leaders look like, they look different across the time continuum. So that's another thing that when you get into more sophisticated analysis can be interesting for your students. Also, I'm going to focus on Don Quixote. This one in particular, if you teach Don Quixote, you will find that you can get this very mission-centric thought going, and you can get the impossible dream thing going on, and the likes of Harvard business folk have espoused this as well. And so this is something that there's some literature on that goes beyond the language classroom, but this is something that's not an idea that's original to us in the language teaching realm. And so what I think I'll do in the interest of time is just point out that if you're interested in you're teaching Spanish and you want to see examples of these, you want to know a little bit more about it, there is an article, it's at the bottom of the screen, and it's on the Google Drive, and you can look at and see there are 4 of us that wrote on teaching Spanish at the Air Force Academy, and there's information about how to do that with the value added. And if you are a very dedicated person who likes to teach literature, and I do, I am not suggesting for a minute that you don't do the regular things you do with your students. Sure, teach about poetic language and genre and all of that, and then teach with a leadership lens on top of it. And what you will get out of it are these 4 things. These are our foundational conclusions. Your students will learn that leaders and leadership look different across cultures. They will learn that leadership and followership interplay unmasks culturally unique critical perspectives that can be very, very sophisticated. You will also see that leader and follower status can be individual. It can run with the individual, but it can also be allegorical and run with the country. For example, we read a novel that had to do with the Napoleonic Wars in Spain, and Spain was not doing so well then because they were being invaded. And so you could raise this to the level of allegory and metaphor and look at how certain nations lead other nations, and that can lead to some very interesting cultural and historical moments in your language and culture classes and literature classes. And lastly, and I think this one may be the most important of all with respect to the kind of data that we got out of our students reflecting on the teaching of leadership being intertwined with literature and culture. And that was that they liked the broader perspective. I liked the broader perspective because it made my literary teaching very fresh. I was doing something new. But for the student, it also personalized the experience because they were often being put in the place of the protagonist or a character, and they had to think about what would they do in that situation, and then they had to reflect on it, and that led them to reflect on their own leadership skills and development. And so I had millennial students talk about how they found the literature more relatable. It didn't seem as obscure. So I think that's something that's a value added, and that helps us out. Since Mary already did talk about the wonderful handbook that is in this slide that I'm showing right now, I'm not going to say a whole lot other than the fact that you need to get your hands on a copy of the LSP Connecting World Language Curriculum to Global Workplace Skills. It's absolutely free. It's available at the Noble site. It is worthy of any language educator using it. It says it's for K through 12, but the activities are just fabulous. And I want to highlight one particular chapter, and that would be Kristen Bleese's chapter. She did and has a wonderful chapter in here. I want to say that Kristen Bleese is a high school educator out of Castle Rock, Colorado, who's subsequently gone on to the Peace Corps, so she's not there anymore. But thankfully, you can look at her name here, you can Google her, and she left a terrific legacy of an entire leadership and Spanish course she developed. And she talks about it online. There are a lot of materials online that are beyond just the materials in the handbook. So I would encourage you to do so. And so essentially, she has step-by-step activities that talk about John Maxwell's indispensable qualities of being a leader. She gets into the standards, how this works. She gets into the reflective piece. She gets into, there are your objectives, there's your vocabulary, and then in the rest of it, you will see it's all laid out there for you. You can use it tomorrow, step-by-step activities. Then she goes into Don Quixote, and then she ends up with some really fun activities that have to do with the TV show The Apprentice, and playing with that with respect to leadership as well. Lastly, I just have one more example that I want to talk about very briefly. When I was out at the U.S. Air Force Academy, we developed a bank of cultural scenarios. And the cultural scenarios, what we decided to do in this faculty learning community is the faculty is fairly transient out at the Air Force Academy because there are a lot of military folk who teach languages, and they go out and they do things in the field, and then they come back and teach. And so out of trying to think of ways to do this so that everybody's not reinventing the wheel all the time, what we thought would be neat is we thought, let's develop a bank, if you will, or repository of cultural scenarios that a new instructor can use across languages, across levels. Some will be language specific, some won't, some will be generic, etc. And so what we did is we published them in Dimension, and that is Skolt's publication. And I have, you can get the article at the Skolt website, or you can look on my Google Drive. We published a white paper. Pete Swanson, the editor, was generous to let us place it there, and it's called Fusing Language Learning and Leadership. And so this particular piece has in the appendix these 7 cultural scenarios. And I'm going to tell you very briefly about one. And one is simply this, that it's for intermediate Portuguese. Ismênia de Souza developed it. And it's a situation that I think will sound very familiar to you. It happens in a lot of cultures. It sets up by saying simply this, that you are in Brazil and you need to extend your visa. So this is a cultural scenario. It's a role play that the students will end up acting out in class. So if you're doing it in language, you're going to have to set up with vocabulary. You're going to have to work your way through those pieces. But here's the scenario. You looked on the internet to determine what you need to do to extend your visa, and you find out that you need to go to the federal police office. It's very hot that day, and so you make a wardrobe choice, and you decide that you are going to wear shorts and flip-flops. So, you know, like a good American, why would you go and not be comfortable? This is how we think, right? But what happens when you get there is that you get to the entrance of the building of the federal police, and an official employee stops you and denies you entry into the building because you are not wearing pants. Now, the hotel that you're staying at is far away, so you won't be able to go back today and complete your business. So your first reaction is one of being annoyed. And so the question that you'll pose is, what do you do in this situation? And so essentially the cultural scenario is just simply that. You can act it out in Portuguese, you can narrate it to your students, but they're going to have to actually put this scenario on, and then they're going to have to come up with an approach to the situation as a leader, not just a personal reaction. And so that shifts the paradigm away from the person that gets angry and, you know, why do I have to put pants on, to like, oops, I'm representing my company and so forth, and so I've got to go about this differently. And so that's an example, a very brief example. There are examples for Arabic, there are examples for French. There are a variety of examples in those cultural scenarios that work like that, and then you can look at them with respect to what you're doing and think about ways that you could adapt them to your classroom. From there, what I wanted to do is essentially get to my last slide. I'm sorry, I've turned into one of those educators. You know, I told my husband I turned into a professor because I must like to listen to myself. In with questions or thoughts, but I wanted to suggest and have you think about this. I started out with the idea that this idea of infusing the language classroom with leadership development is a fairly new and emerging pedagogy. It's essentially in diapers. I talked a lot about experimentation going on. There's not a body of research that's very robust. There are a few articles out there, not many. And then there are a lot of materials that could be developed. And so I just added some brainstorming bullets here that have to do with other directions that this discussion might take. We might want to consider language educators as leaders in the classroom, in the community, and in the profession, and that certainly connects back with that wonderful video we saw that ACTFL produced. We might want to go back in history, and this would in particular appeal to the classicist, but I think it also appeals to all of us, and think about the history of citizenship, how it relates to leadership, Go back to Plato. I mean, there's lots of angles here. Consider developing materials. So consider developing materials like cultural scenarios that we could be sharing on a common site. That might be a great thing for a professional association to do. I think ACTFL has some of that going on already. This idea of not feeling like we have to reinvent the wheel to do this, but have ready-made materials that'll help us infuse leadership into our instructional materials, whatever they might be. And then lastly, consider student leadership in class and then beyond class, experientially, abroad, and then of course outside of class in classroom activities. So what I want to do is stop because I've been talking nonstop, but you can tell I get really jazzed and excited about this. And I'm going to put my intro slide back up. That's me. I realize some of you need to go. And please go if you need to. And I've got my email address there for you. And if you want to linger and we have time for some discussion and some comments, I would absolutely love that. Mary, would you like to break in and let us know how much time you have?
Yes, people can feel free to type questions in the chat box, or if they want to talk into with the microphone, I can give. They raise their hand, I'll give them microphone privileges. So whatever people feel comfortable with.
Great. I see comments coming in. Yeah, and there's two great things here. My good colleague Bobby Hobgood has reminded you that you can get a hold of things on the bit.ly URL, which is in the chat box right now. Paul Sandrock has called out something that's great and neglected to mention it at the beginning of the presentation, and that's that ACTFL has a summer institute on leadership that we're all really excited about going on, if I'm not mistaken, near the end of July. And you can go to the URL that he has typed for us there, and you can take a look at it so that if that's another place that you should be able to get resources, learn about leadership. It does, yeah, Mary has said, yes, the Institute looks great, and it does. And Mary and I will actually be finishing up the AATSP at that point in time. So we're hoping that there will be future leadership and language institutes that we can participate in another summer, but it's something that we're looking forward to. Any other questions or comments? In those that are left standing? Yeah. I appreciate Mary saying we hope we can get the results from the Institute shared somewhere. And for those of us that can't be there in person, I also wondered when I saw it whether there was any plan on the part of ACTFL to be piping out any of the plenaries or any of the sessions so that it might be a more broad dissemination than just the group of people that end up in Ohio. Something to think about. I don't know if that plan exists. I understand you have to go. Please go. I know that I see Melinda's name, and she talked about her business Spanish course. And I think that the primary resource right now is probably Michael Doyle's textbook, Éxito Social. And in his new edition, he's gotten very jazzed. He's one of my favorite colleagues here at UNC Charlotte, and he also did some time at the Air Force Academy. And so he got really jazzed about this new edition of his business text and really notching up the leadership development in it. So there should be, get your hands on a copy of the new edition of Éxito, because I think there will be good things there as well. Any other comments or questions? I thought I really feel bad that I talked so long. Yes, the name of the business text. Let me see if I can talk and type at the same time. It's Éxito Comercial. And it's going to be a little, and I can't remember the number of the edition, but the latest edition, and it's published with Cengage. So I'm sure if you have a Cengage rep, they can get it for you.
Oh yeah, please everybody, the webinar will be recorded. I mean, it is recorded, sorry. So it will be posted.
And so that you get a hold of the right edition, Bobby Hobgood has helped me out with that. He Googled it quickly, so we've got the 6th edition of Éxito. My new edition of Nexos, the 4th edition, will have some of these leadership pieces woven into it with references to the ACTFL map. So I would say that we are probably not that original, and that you will be seeing a lot of this in sort of mainline publishing as well, and to be looking for it. Great. Bobby shot us the URL to be looking at that. And I want to remind some of you in particular to Google search Kristen Blees. And she's got a lovely, complex spelling to her name. It is a lot of materials that are, you know, in the public domain that you can use that have to do with her Spanish for Leadership course. If Spanish isn't your language, you may see things there that you can adapt.
I'm also posting the link for all past webinars.
Excellent.
And soon.
And when I'm reflecting on what I did today, there was definitely overlap with Annie Abbott's. So that's a place, if you did not see Annie Abbott's webinar, it was about languages for specific purposes, but it touched upon leadership development as well.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, so I guess we don't have any more, no questions. And you guys have Sheri's email if you want to contact her individually.
Please follow up. I know that being the last presenter in the series and in May, it's amazing that most of you made it through the webinar, and that I did, because we're all pretty worn out at the end of the semester. But this is an exciting topic. And I think that, you know, it's something that we're going to be hearing a lot more about. In fact, Jean Lalou, my dear colleague at the Air Force Academy, and I are going to be presenting on leadership development and language learning at ACTFL. So we will have a session there. If you're at ACTFL, we'd love to have you attend. And it will be in San Diego.
Great. Okay, well, then I'll just take this opportunity to thank Sheri for all the great materials, ideas, and everything. And thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to go ahead and